God, I've heard the peasants are giggling about Monty Python again. There's nothing worse than them quoting Holy Grail in those other movies. It reminds me of all those theater nerds in high school. But my lord, the Monty Python movies and television programs have served as an important entry to pop culture, skewering everything from class to religion to the Catholic religion. Look, Biggis, the fact is, I think that comedy is fine, and religion is fine, obviously, but the two should not be so intimately woven. Perhaps if we wrote a tabletop RPG that allows these upstarts to sort of self-sequester themselves. Yes, they can grab their dice and a rulebook and just boil themselves in endless Monty Python jokes and references, instead of parading those awful things in public. Brilliant idea, sir! I do have those sometimes, don't I? Monty Python Co-Curricular Medieval Reenactment Program is an officially licensed Monty Python RPG written by Brian Saliba and Craig Schaefer. It was published in 2025 following a successful Kickstarter the year before. I think before we jump in, we have to address the 800-pound foot in the room, and that is the question of, what the hell is Monty Python? Is it a man? Is it a snake? Actually, Monty Python was a British comedy troupe formed in 1969 by John Cleese, Graham Chapman, Terry Gilliam, Eric Idle, Terry Jones, and Michael Palin. They pioneered and popularized very offbeat, irreverent sketch comedy with Monty Python's Flying Circus, a show that ran from 1969 to 1974, as well as a string of influential films, including, first and foremost, 1975's Monty Python and the Holy Grail, as well as The Life of Brian in 1979, which was actually a fairly coherent story that showed a lot of creative constraint and focus, and The Meaning of Life from 1983, a smut-filled acid trip of a movie that returned to the roots of the Flying Circus show. Monty Python continued through the 80s and 90s and ultimately left a massive impact on comedic style, structure, and cultural commentary, paving the way for prominent British comedians such as Eddie Izzard, Piers Morgan, Theresa May, and Henry David. Python's humor was surreal, absurd, and often pushed boundaries. Some found it hilarious, while others were put off by its off-kilter pacing and controversial topics. I think nowadays some folks might find the humor too random and frenetic to be funny, but you just have to remember what it was like to experience that stuff back when it first came out. It was revolutionary in a lot of ways, especially the social commentary aspect. All right, with that out of the way, we get to Monty Python's Co-Curricular Medieval Reenactment Program. In this video, I want to get into the main rulebook and walk you through the rules, setting, concept, presentation, and all that jazz. Then I want to share with you my thoughts after having run a session of the game with real live test subjects, almost none of whom were harmed in the process. And finally, my honest pros and cons about this role-playing game. And also somewhere in there include a shameless plug for my Patreon. The Patreon plugs will continue until morale improves. Also, one last thing to mention, I did a written interview with Brian Saliba, the chief creator of this game. I was pretty cheeky and sarcastic with the interview, but I did try to actually ask some penetrating questions about the game's design. Brian returned the favor in kind. It was definitely one of the most humorous written interviews I've ever done on my newsletter. I'll leave a link to that below. Okay, let's talk about this game by diving into its core rulebook. First of all, the cover has role-playing game crossed out with the words "no, it isn't" scrawled in. This is just one of the 10,000 jokes contained in the rulebook. This really is just a role-playing game, although the conceit is that you're actually reenacting medieval history. I'll just point this out now and try to refrain from mentioning it too much throughout the video, but the graphic design and layout of this book is actually pretty brilliant. They really captured the sort of scrapbook pastiche nature of Monty Python. It's possible that at a glance this all looks kind of messy and janky, but this is a very intentional aesthetic that mirrors the style of Monty Python's interludes, cutaways, and other animated bits in their TV show and movies. Any one of these two-page spreads could take hours to put together, so for them to have cobbled together 360 pages of this stuff where no two spreads look the same and everything is still pretty readable is quite an accomplishment in my opinion. I think the first notable thing about this game is the fact that it uses weird dice. And by weird, I mean
even slightly weirder than Goodman Games' dice, since those don't use a D18. I guess to get these weird denominations, you'll have to either buy the official specialty dice from the game's publisher or use an online dice roller, the latter option of which is almost always free. I'll explain how the dice work in a minute. Despite all of the overly exuberant visual design of the game, it still goes through all the paces of a standard full-length RPG, complete with explaining what an RPG is, and a reminder to not be a wanker at the table and all that. Although I have to say, the writing is so effusively sarcastic and cheeky, if this were the first RPG book you've ever read in your life, you might actually be a bit confused. But let's face it, most people reading this book will have read an RPG rulebook before. I think if there was one missed beat in this whole book, it's this chapter that sort of summarizes England of the Middle Ages. It stumbles on a couple of fronts. The first is that the layout guys decided on this particular typeset for most of the text, and this is just painful to read. You can read it, but you can't read it very fast, so it's just frustrating. The second is that the author walks you through the world of what is essentially 10th century England, or whatever it called itself back then, but frankly, it misses out or glosses over all kinds of hilarious details about that time and place. Or maybe the way it was presented just didn't emphasize the ridiculousness of that time period. The whole chapter only runs a handful of pages, but it could have been a huge source of hilarious, actual historical details about the Dark Ages, where people did a lot of weird things. If you're curious about what I'm talking about, you should check out The Time Traveler's Guide to Medieval England by Ian Mortimer. I'll leave a link below.
Attention, loyal citizens of Rome and other present and future fascist states. If you find any value in these reviews, then drop a few denarii into the Dave Thaumavore RPG Reviews Patreon treasury. Think of it as funding our legions, ensuring we march onward with more informative reviews and critiques. Your support guarantees our glorious channel entries continue unabated, and it also gives you access to our secret Discord garrison, where you can give me guff about these awful digital avatars, and I'll actually listen. We stalwarts of the Discord server are men of the spear, and as you know, when it comes to spears, the longer the better.
Okay, here on this chapter explaining how the mechanics work, it starts with some very sage advice. It says here that in order to be funny, everyone should take the situations as seriously as possible, almost like how the knights in Holy Grail act. And by doing so, the humor of each situation will burst through more effectively. I wholeheartedly agree with this approach to humorous RPGs, or really most RPGs. I find that when players try hard to be funny, they have the opposite effect. It's one of the reasons I can't watch most actual plays. But alright, here's how the game actually works. Every character has 3 to 5 traits. These traits are selected or assigned from a list of 18 traits in the game, and they are permanent to the character. If you have a trait, it is rated via step dice. A trait can be rated as high as a D20, which means anytime you initiate that trait in a voluntary test, called a deed, then you roll a d20 and add modifiers from special items or other sources. And the goal is to meet or exceed a target number determined by a GM. But a trait can be rated all the way as low as a d4. And if you're testing a trait that your character doesn't even have, then you roll a d4 on that deed roll. One important thing to note here is that the game doesn't want you rolling too much. It really wants you as a player to be invested in the narrative. Not necessarily the plot, but the scene at hand, much like a Monty Python skit. To encourage this kind of play behavior, a player is awarded an automatic success if they can describe their deed with enough spirit and detail, as determined by the GM. This is probably the strongest example of RP over G that I've ever encountered in an RPG. There's another kind of role actually called a test, which is a bit confusing. You might know this role as a save, where the player rolls to react to or defend against some kind of incoming threat. The GM picks a trait for you to roll on, but you can also lobby to use another trait if you want, but you're meant to not be a tosser about it. If you roll the maximum value of the die being rolled at any point, then 2 things happen. First, you increase the trait rating up once on the spectrum, and second, you roll the new larger die and add that to the roll result. And if you roll the maximum again for that die, you increase the trait and roll again, and repeat as necessary. If you get to a d20, You can't increase the trait anymore, but you'll keep rolling the d20 and adding the result as long as you keep hitting 20. Rolling the max on a die is called a struthing, which is the most British sounding word they could find. It's not even a word actually, it's just a sound that is meant to give you mild chest pains. On the flip side of a struthing, if you roll a 1 at any point with any die, then you have spammed the roll. In that case, you will decrease your trait rating by 1 die and take a so-called demerit from the GM. Demerits are a general point pool of negativity that add up over time and eventually result in beshreuments. There are 18 different beshreuments tables depending on which persona the GM assumes, and the player rolls a d30 to see what tragic thing befalls them. A 1 will kill you every time here, and there are all manner of calamity that can ensue. You generally don't want beshreuments to happen, which means you don't want to accumulate demerits. Merits, on the other hand, are earned by doing whatever makes the GM happy, which is how meta points work in most RPGs if you think about it. And you can spend merits to buy an extra die on a roll or to cancel a demerit. There are 2 kinds of damage that you can take, physical and mental. It's pretty straightforward. Once you get to the end of the line on either, then your character is no more. One interesting mechanic is that you can sacrifice your special items, called accoutrements, or your followers, if you have any, called retainers, in order to cancel out incoming damage of either type. Alright, here are the 18 different traits that your character could possibly have. They all range from being very highly rated to abysmally rated, and importantly, they all initially come with a special accoutrement. Let's just take a look at one trait, bardistry. All starting accoutrements lend a bonus to one trait or another, and half of them have some other special feature or notation about them, usually a mix of humor and actual mechanical significance. Make no mistake though, the accoutrements in this game are an important part of your character's makeup. As mentioned before, your character may or may not qualify to have 1 or 2 retainers following them around, and there are 12 retainer archetypes in the game. They have to get paid each day with one kind of thing or another, and they also carry accoutrements of their own. Their per diems can get a little involved, such as with the poet, who once per day must witness some moving scene or they'll otherwise stagger away in tears. Finally, you choose your so-called situation. You can think of this as your character's vocation or class or archetype. Each situation comes with a list of traits they must and may have, as well as other unique features. Each one also gets a special superpower called a spiffing serious ability, which, when evoked in the fiction, has the player roll a d30 to see what happens. Higher rolls on this ability result in ground-shaking effects to the scene, sometimes literally. There's a whole chapter on how to effectively GM this game, and I deem it pretty useful. This is not really a challenging game to run for the most part, since it's so rules light and spontaneous. It is a real RPG though, so you do have to consider the challenges to be presented in a session, as well as the right target numbers to set for any given role. I thought one really bizarre but perfectly thematic tool in the GM's toolbox was this set of what I can only describe as cutaway skits. Anytime you want in the fiction, you can sort of pull all the players out of a scene and plop them into what amounts to a segment of 1960s television programming. They will participate in the segment, it will conclude, and then they will return to their ongoing story. This really only makes sense if you understand the nature of Monty Python humor and the format of their flying circus show and their other stuff. And I think the biggest challenge here is to just make sure that players are all read in on this type of humor. You can't have any grumpies at the table playing this game or they'll just spoil it for everyone. I don't want to reveal too many of the NPCs and adversaries presented in this game, but I do have to note that the illustrations for each of them is really well done. Also, they each come with 2 or 3 attacks and the things they like, don't like, and what they want. Believe it or not, those last bits there are woefully missing in a lot of bestiaries, and they're very useful for GMs to have. It wasn't until I got to this section that I realized that this game could easily serve as a book for Monty Python fans who have no intention of running or playing this game. It's just so full of Monty Python references presented in a fun and entertaining format. There are actually dozens of these NPCs, and even though you get all the same basic info for each one to present them as an adversary in a scene, no two spreads are the same. It's visually just a very dynamic book. Also, a note about combat in this game: by no means are you meant to kill every adversary you come across. Victory in a contest could translate to nothing more than winning an argument or being allowed to continue on a path or something. But yeah, the fan service combined with actual functional RPG material here is quite a triumph. Not to mention there's a whole other chapter that details creatures and more monstrous enemies, some of which contain some truly funny and interesting features. The atomically mutated cat, for example, contains 18 undigested animals. If you can get the cat to puke them all out, each one wears a little bell tied to them, and if your player wears that bell, they get a bonus to one trait or another. I thought this was pretty decent, surreal game design. Again, I don't want to reveal all the well-drawn beasts in this game, but they really are thoughtfully designed. Finally, there are 10 quests included at the end of the book, ranging from novice to intermediate to expert. I was really grateful for these when I set out to run a session of this game myself, because I didn't know where to start as a GM trying to put together an adventure. I ended up settling on running the quest called Spank the Pope, which really sort of spoils the quest right there in the title. PCs are quested by God to spank Pope John XII for being naughty. That's the long and short of it. So let me share with you my takeaways from actually running this game. The story kinda doesn't matter. This game does more or less want your players on quests, and your players can die, and they do have expendable resources and all that, but really the only thing that matters is the scene at hand. Everyone is meant to improv in that Monty Python absurdist fashion as best they can and riff off of each other. If you're accomplishing that, then you're really playing the game. Characters don't progress. Since this game is more about the scene-to-scene experience, the progression of a character doesn't really matter. You can improve certain traits and get accoutrements and maybe a retainer here and there, and maybe some goofy money, but largely your character remains static because they're meant to serve as a vehicle for silly jokes rather than one for growth and any kind of real storytelling. Book organization is rough on players. My players had a little bit of a rough time trying to put together their characters due to the organization of the book. We also all agreed that a rules cheat sheet for the game would be an incredible asset to have. There really aren't that many rules to the game, and you could probably fit all of it onto 1 or 2 pages. The game did what it was supposed to do. I may have gotten lucky with my particular players, but I think this game really does have you thinking like a Monty Python character. Everyone just has to lean in on all the religious parody, toilet humor, and surreal absurdist weirdness, and they're off to the races. Alright, here are my thoughts on the Monty Python RPG. Cons. Could have skipped the D18. I don't mind weird dice at all. I have a couple of sets myself, from Goodman Games that is. The creators here got really close to being consumer friendly by just adapting the same dice array as the dice sets from Dungeon Crawl and Mutant Crawl Classics, but they didn't quite get there. It would have opened up hundreds of dice set options for players and GMs, all but for that D18, which is so weird that even Goodman Games doesn't make them. Historical section, hard to read, missed out on some details. I love reading stuff about actual medieval England because it's so strange and hilarious, and I think this book could have really embraced more of that weirdness with a more researched chapter, and as a cherry on top, a more readable font. GM personas a tad hard to juggle. The GM is expected to adopt one of 18 different personas, each with different likes, dislikes, and beshrew tables, and they're occasionally expected to change personas during a session. I like the idea of all the different tables of calamities, but the burden of having to be a certain persona while also managing other traditional GM duties is a lot to juggle. It's just something that takes a bit of practice, I think. Pros. Actually simulates Monty Python silliness. This game's design actually manages to create a Monty Python simulator and gives you all the references and tools to do it. I can always tell when a game based on an IP is done from a place of passion and love for the source material, and this game's successful design is obviously born from that passion. Unique, simple mechanics. The mechanics being as simple as they are definitely serve the mission of creating a skit, comedy, holy grail simulator, but the fact that they developed some novel rules and procedures is really appreciated. They could have bolted Monty Python onto any of 100 different free third-party licensed rule sets and called it a day, but they actually did some heavy lifting here and made a unique game. Visual presentation is a masterpiece. I'll say it again, I think the internal layout of this book is a bit of brilliance. Each spread is desperately trying to entertain you, and there is so little copy-pasting from one section to the next that it's actually just a fun, engaging reading experience all its own, whether you end up playing the game or not. Extra bits are nice. I didn't cover it in this video, but the digital version comes with 10 pre-filled character sheets, one for each character archetype, as well as some printable standees and rules for a little side game called Fetches Lavache. It's like backgammon, but you're catapulting livestock and Englishmen, so basically backgammon. And actually, they include the rules for actual backgammon too, which is really handy if you ever find yourself in Istanbul. Just trust me on that one. Yeah, so those are my thoughts on Monty Python's co-curricular medieval reenactment program. It turned out to be a surprisingly thorough, competent, and completely functional role-playing game that accomplishes its mission of simulating Monty Python humor. I can't stress enough the fact that I'm so glad I got away from Dungeons & Dragons, if only to find and experience games like this. The whole point of this channel is to get people outside the walled garden of D&D so they can see what RPGs can really do. If you also believe in this mission, consider supporting me on Patreon and joining my newsletter. I'd really like to hear your thoughts on Monty Python down in the comments, and let me know if you've backed this game and if you've played it or run it. I guess if you don't have any real opinions or anything, you can always just give me your favorite Monty Python line down below. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.
I trust our new TTRPG has trapped those Monty Python fans in a dungeon of their own jokes. Yes, my lord, they're now every one of them, clattering weird dice in their respective basements, trying to outrun giant animated feet. Excellent! Let them have their blasphemous games that make fun of so many important institutions and concepts. It is a shame, though. What's a shame, Your Excellence? A shame that they should be rolling dice and playing that Monty Python RPG rather than the one true RPG, the one that does it all and more. Which RPG is that, my lord? The one that dares not stoop to giant feet or talking pudding. It's pure, sacred roleplay, free of irreverent lunacy. Yes? Yes, the game called GURPS. Oh, you're one of them, eh?